Welcome to the Futurati podcast. Any member of the Futurati is somebody who believes in the power of the future. We know there's a better world ahead, and we indeed have the power to make it so. In our podcast, we talk to the best minds in the world about the most urgent problems facing mankind today, and we hope you learn as much from them as we do. I'm Thomas Fry, a professional futurist and keynote speaker.
And I'm Trent Fowler, a machine learning engineer and author. Thank you for joining us. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for listening to the Futurati podcast. Tonight, we're joined by Nathan Young. Nathan is a corporate strategist and marketing expert who has been exceptionally active in the Effective Altruism movement, the prediction markets community, and in discussions around designing good policy. If you enjoy this interview, please don't forget to like the episode and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to check out our website, futuratipodcast.com. Nathan, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, let's hear a little bit about your background, your interests, and what brought you to working on the myriad projects you're working on today.
So I guess as far as forecasting is concerned, I saw some stuff around, 2020, early 2020. I think maybe I read Ted Lock's book, and I was like, maybe I should check out these forecasting sites. What are they saying? And then it was just like, panic, there's going to be a pandemic. And I was like, wow, this really seems like I should trust this, but no one's concerned about the pandemic. And I talked to my dad, and he was like, SARS was fine, this is going to be too much. And on little group chats, you can see my friends have put my face on the man with a sandwich board saying the end is nigh. Right. So I got into it. I thought it was interesting. And then I sort of started a project called the Coronavirus Tech Handbook because I thought it was going to be a problem, and lo and behold, coronavirus happened. And so I guess that's the thing which really cemented in my mind that forecasting was a good idea because it helped me at this sort of key time. So to sort of skip backwards, I did a maths degree. I ran a sort of small web development company for a while. I had a sort of existential crisis and decided that I wanted to make more of my life than I was. I moved, and then I tried to move to a new city, and then coronavirus happened. So that's been a somewhat interesting experience. And then after that, I guess, I've been asking more questions around how can forecasting be used? How can we get better decisions? And how can we be less wrong as individuals? I'm prone to being very overconfident. And so I like to have a way to hold myself to account.
Yeah, so I definitely want to follow up on the Coronavirus Tech Handbook because I was reading a little bit about that and doing research for this interview. But I thought first we could focus on the prediction markets angle. So you noted that it's a way for you to correct a bias towards being overconfident and kind of holding yourself accountable. And you think that it's a suitable mechanism for allowing better collective decision making. So can you just walk us through what a prediction market is for somebody who hasn't heard about it? And then I've got some follow-up questions on how they work.
Right. So there are two fundamental types. So a prediction market in its simplest terms is that you say either whether something will happen or it won't, or you give some percentage surety, and then you are rewarded in some currency if it happens or if it doesn't, depending on what you said. And so the kind of two basic ones are financial markets, where there will be some assets which you either buy the it's going to happen asset or the it's not going to happen asset. And so you say, this asset, the it's going to happen asset, it's underpriced, I'll buy it. And it will give me money when it happens. And so that's one side. And on the other side is reputational markets, where you don't get any money, no money's involved, but you get internet points and prestige. And if people have heard of super forecasters, being a super forecaster is a kind of prestige. And so you're either sort of fighting against reality or you're fighting against your fellow forecasters. The sort of broad strokes, and don't quote me on this, but the broad strokes are that they're roughly similar for short-term things. There may be financial markets update slightly quicker because people have real incentives to jump in. Recently there's been a lot of markets around Ukraine, and as soon as news breaks, people might think actually that this event is a bit different, so that they might jump into a market like that, and so they might be a bit incentivized to predict quicker. But for really long-term markets, prediction markets where you pay don't have very good incentives because you don't want to leave your money tied to an asset for years or maybe decades when you could just leave it in an index fund and make more money at lower risk.
I see. So something about the underlying mechanism just disincentivizes parking an asset for the long term in a prediction market to arrive at a better understanding.
Yeah. So let's say you think there's an event which is you think is almost certain, like 99% likely to happen, and the market thinks it's 50% likely to happen. So if that event is happening tomorrow, then you can put in a load of money today and you can take out twice the amount of money tomorrow. And that's absolutely fantastic. You're certain it's going to happen. This is just, deterministic money making. But if that's in like 10 years time, then you might as well leave your money in the bank at 7% for your 10-year period, and you will make, I don't know, 1.07 to the power 10. Someone can do that for me. But that's like a relatively similar amount. And if it's longer than that, then, you could have made double in one day is great. Double in 10 years, not so much.
Where are you getting 7% interest on savings in a bank account?
Isn't that the rough, don't quote again, isn't that the rough amount that like the index funds have gone up over like the last 100 years? I don't know. That's like the number.
Oh, that's possible. Yeah, I was thinking your checking account. Yeah, I mean, I suppose.
Oh yeah, no.
The banks in England very different. Like that's.
No, they are not.
Excellent.
Yeah, that's the number in my head.
So I wanted to ask about the sorts of questions that prediction markets are good at solving. We've sort of tackled that from one perspective with respect to long-term and short-term and the two different kinds of markets. But just generally, what are the sorts of things that you see people successfully getting clarity on via prediction markets? And what are some things that like wouldn't be as well suited for it?
Yeah, so I guess at this point, I'm going to language I use like prediction markets versus prediction polls being the reputational one. So we're going to talk about the money one here.
Okay.
The money ones, I think, as we say, short term, I think for people to want to put their money in, they need to have trust in the organization and they need to have trust in the resolution criteria. So, again, around Ukraine, which is something I've been thinking about, there's like the fall of Kiev, but what does the fall of Kiev mean? Like, when does it fall? How do you decide whether it's fallen? Mm-hmm. I think the criteria that one organization, a prediction poll, is using Metaculus. Someone pointed out that Stalingrad would have counted as having fallen because it's like percentage of city area that is controlled by the besieging force.
Right.
But actually, most people consider Stalingrad not to have fallen. And so if you're looking at a market like that, you're sort of saying, well, I'm not sure how this market's going to resolve. I think I know what's going to happen, but I'm not sure I can trust it anyway. So that would be a bad market. Another example of a bad market is maybe one with reputational risk. So a lot of markets, I think prediction markets have moved quite a long way in terms of what they're willing to talk about. So Kalshi are willing to talk about variants of concern around COVID. And I think probably 2 years ago, so 3 years ago, that would have been quite icky to talk about, disease. But people are still very unwilling to talk about like deaths in a broad sense. Death makes people uncomfortable. And so, can you have a question about, the number of people who are going to die from COVID or die in an invasion or die from some other thing, or maybe just like more national figures, you might want to ask, the winter flu thing. Again, those are questions that people don't currently like. So you want questions with good, crisp, well-agreed criteria. Will Djokovic play in the next Open? Will he win? Those are some questions, everyone's going to agree what happens there. What will the next number one be? Will a certain person be in charge of a country? But even that is a bit confusing. You might decide that there's a difference between de facto and being the president, say. But yeah, those really clear questions, and where there's a clear string between the reality and the resolution criteria. Because remember, you're always guessing whatever the resolution criteria is. And so I think on Polymarket this week, there was something where it was based guessing the number of refugees. And then the refugee organization offered sort of 3 rapid corrections. And so obviously the market zapped up and zipped down and zipped back up again. and you're not predicting reality, you're predicting the resolution criteria. And again, if those things can get too distant from one another, then people can lose trust.
I see. And to what extent do you see that being gamed in prediction markets? I'm not super active in prediction markets, but it seems like there might be issues around linguistic ambiguity and what actually counts as a resolution. Is that usually something that's handled up front? Have markets just learned how to handle that better, or is that sort of an ongoing problem?
I think markets are aware, and again, I think there'll be people who know much more about this than I do. I am sort of, I say, a broad generalist in this area, and so, but I do think markets are aware of this problem, and they are quite conservative, small c conservative about dealing with it. Like, they don't like to touch markets where they think there's going to be a concern about that stuff. They like to have crisp criteria. I think there's the only one example I think this is true. You say 90% chance this is true. There was a poly market around, I think it was House of Gucci, the film, about whether it would sell a certain number of tickets, and it was quite close. And then someone just bought a ton of yes on the market, and then just bought a ton of tickets. And you can decide for yourself if you think that is gaming. Like, the tickets were really purchased. But yeah, I mean, markets also create incentives in the opposite direction.
So that's similar to if you buy a lot of your own books on Amazon and you can become a bestseller in some category for a while.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about kind of the areas of confusion. You wrote the coronavirus handbook, and there was so many areas of confusion. I mean, we're having dinner last night and asking I brought up the idea that I don't think the barcode menus ever saved a single life. And I find the barcode menus actually be quite inconvenient to use. And the fact that we no longer have salt and pepper shakers on tables also is, it's one of those things that you just kind of grown to expect, and maybe it's actually healthier not having them there. But this type of thing added lots of extra confusion around the front end of something, because we didn't really understand the parameters yet of the disease, and then that fed into lots of other trust and distrust of all of the recommendations coming down the pike, because some of the requirements were a bit too onerous. Can you comment a little bit on that as you were putting together your handbook?
Yeah, so the handbook was this big, open source. Anyone could comment and add resources around the start of the pandemic. So before the pandemic happened, I guess a couple of weeks, I launched it, and then some of my co-founders joined in very early March. So it was, in the UK, it was a couple of weeks before the government response. I don't know quite when the US response happened. And I mean, again, for me, this links to the forecasting stuff, is that everyone can know something, but nobody can say it because they don't have a reputable source. And I think this happened a little bit with Ukraine, that people, they were afraid to say it's probably going to happen, whereas prediction markets don't need to be afraid. People can just put money on it sort of in secret, anonymously. And so none of the big organizations, they didn't want to say a wrong thing. They had a lot of downside risk, and I guess they personally weren't going to get a lot of benefit by giving clear instructions. They didn't know what was happening. And so we created sort of somewhere between Google Docs and Wikipedia. Anyone could add resources. And so, very quickly you had pages springing up, advice for doctors, literally health pathways, things moving through, advice for mutual aid groups. So there's big sort of community uprising, kind of of people helping their neighbors. People buying, if you had an elderly relative who might not be safe, people buying stuff for them and communicating in WhatsApp groups. People making ventilators. I don't know if you remember in the early pandemic, that was a really big deal in a way that I think has been largely forgotten. And so, yeah, I think there was this thing about we were able to offer advice in a space and nobody else felt comfortable to. And then after sort of a month or so, some of those big institutional players came in behind and started offering their kind of, the stamp of approval advice. To answer your question more specifically, yeah, I think there is a big question about cost and benefit, and much like planes and plane security, and whether you think plane security has saved lots of lives, or whether you think it's a massive hassle, and how many lives it should save for it, those are difficult questions. And I think this is quite similar. Like, I definitely know people who, the UK is more or less back to pre-pandemic state. You see people maybe wearing them on the underground, on the tube in London. But other than that, things are basically, I guess I go to social gatherings and often people say, oh, can someone take a lateral flow test, which the government gives out free beforehand? And like, that's quite normal amongst my friends, but some people's friendship groups, I think, have just gone back. I mean, yeah, I guess I think that there are real costs to these actions, and there are costs to lockdowns, and I'm glad that life has more or less got back to normal in the UK, I think. Though I know that some people are still struggling, and that's sad, but I think there is a cost benefit to be done.
Yeah, so that dovetails kind of nicely with some of the questions I had around policy. So if I'm not mistaken, you also put together a tech handbook for policymakers or people who wanted to gather information related to elections or policy positions, things like that. So given that you've thought a lot about that space, what are the general principles you have for designing good policy, and in particular around situations like the coronavirus, where it's not clear what the magnitude of the event will be or how even clearly to weigh the costs and the benefits? How do you approach that?
I mean, okay, that's a big question. And for clarity, the Election Tech Handbook was a handbook around a similar thing. Yes, where we got the name. These handbooks are basically when you see something coming down the road, you think people aren't going to be well coordinated. And similarly with UK election, there's often lots of people who want to help, as is, I think the US elections have a lot more money, but the UK, you have to remember in the UK, I think the numbers, off the top of my head again, like don't take these too seriously, but I think the numbers are like the whole UK party system could be funded for about like $20 million, I think, in like an election year. And that is just like bananas cheap money compared to the US. And so, there's all these people, most of them are just working for free. And so, giving them a space to talk and to share resources, to ask people for data, to look around for APIs, that's really helpful. And I should give a shout out to my co-founders, Ed Superior and Joe Reeve, who helped me with the Coronavirus Tech Handbook, and Newspeak House was the organization, this political tech hub that I was at the time for those things. And I guess in terms of policy, so the quick answer, we can dig into this, but the quick answer is that I think things should have a numerical edge, or maybe a numerical center, when you're thinking about these policies, that most people are actually quantifying things in their heads, whether they say they are or not. When you're looking at restaurants to choose, if you were forced, you could give them some scores. You'd be like, oh, Burger King's a 7, McDonald's is an 8, I don't care. Like, if you were forced and you're doing some kind of comparison, and the question is whether that comparison actually maps to reality. And so I think in the early days of coronavirus, people were probably thinking, oh, like there's going to be panic, that's bad. But, what I would like to see is, how bad on a numerical level, how much suffering does panic cause? And you can't quantify everything. I'm not saying you can, but I think sometimes people can look at two big numbers and say they're pretty similar when one of those numbers is, say, 10,000 times bigger than the other. And that's a real problem. But like, what I would say, like, as the second part of this is like, it's not really about policy. I guess I would say it's often about incentives that decision makers have. And I think so in the UK, politicians are paid, like most politicians are paid less than like a teacher at a school, like a head teacher of a school, like will be paid, I don't know, £130,000 or something, I don't know. But like but most MPs are paid like £75,000, which I guess is like what, like 80 or $90,000. So that's like the top level decision makers in the UK. That's how much they're paid. They have to do like 2 or 3 jobs at once. They have to like do like community surgeries where they go around. They have to travel across the country backwards and forth. They have to do negotiations with their colleagues. They have to stand in line to vote for a long time, and so they don't have like, they're very busy and they don't have loads of time to read through and think about upcoming sort of existential crises. I think most of the things I think about around policy are around how can we give people more space or better incentives to think over a longer time scale. Politicians are very well incentivized to think what will get them elected next time. And I don't think that's sort of callous or short-sighted of them. I think that's, they have families. They don't want their kids to be unable to eat.
Sure.
Like any of us would.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, around policy, my questions are, how do you pay them enough and give them maybe like a sort of stipend afterwards? How do you incentivize a broad range of people to be able to get into politics when it costs so much money up front? And then I think you might be able to have some people who are able to spend, that extra time in, again, like with the Ukraine crisis, it doesn't surprise me if politicians aren't spending loads of time in January and February of this year before it really became big news looking at this, because they are just phenomenally busy people.
Yeah. In going back to coronavirus issues, it seemed like the policy people there were focused on one objective, and it was much bigger than that. They were very myopic in how they were looking at solving the problem, but overlooking all of the ancillary things, and the unintended consequences became huge. Just the number of people quitting their jobs, leaving far fewer people in the workforce, the shortages of everything, this whole supply chain issues, just chip shortages, car shortages, and then the ramp up of homelessness and suicides and domestic abuse and ancillary things that people were dying from that increased dramatically. And so how do you create policy effectively without turning a blind eye to all of the unintended consequences that could happen?
Well, I mean, I think you've got to remember that policymakers, so we've talked about politicians, there's also civil servants, but like policymakers, they get like very bad things happen when things go wrong. So not necessarily like terrible things. People sometimes get fired, sometimes not. Though, nobody wants something to go wrong. But like, how good do the good things that happen if things go right? So if you imagine you're a VC, right? Like, you invest in 100 companies, and one of those companies, a billion X is in value or whatever, and the rest go bankrupt. And so, you lost the money, like that was bad, the money you lost, but like the one that goes right more than covers for all of those losses. I think you imagine a civil servant or, a politician, both of those in the same situation, I think they're going to be hounded far more for the 99 projects that failed than the one project which succeeded vastly. I think people will just kind of go, but like, what about all this? Those failures will be brought up for years, maybe decades.
Right.
And if you're like a middle manager in an organization, are you going to, if you're a VC, you get some of the carry, don't you? You get like you get a load of money. You're really wealthy, and you're wealthy in proportion to how much money you make. Whereas you're not something in proportion to how many lives you save. And I'm not implying that these people do it for the money or that they want lots more money, but I'm just saying that, like, on a basis, humans are motivated by things. And I think if you're sitting at your desk as a VC being like, oh, this seems like a risky bet, but it might go well, but it's going to cover all my other bets, then you're likely to take it. Whereas if you're a policymaker who's like, well, even if this goes well, I think this portfolio is such that probably most are going to fail and I'm going to be net down a long way, then that's the reason that people make these kind of what might be considered safe choices, which I think you look at and you think. So, in the UK, one thing that was suggested was challenge trials. So you get volunteers, and they volunteer to be given maybe a vaccine or a placebo, and then they get so maybe then they get infected, or they're allowed to be infected, and then you get like much more rapid data because they all get infected, and you can see how much and they get like state of the art medical care. They're low risk people anyway, but you can really look at these two groups, and you can be like, and maybe you get much quicker approvals. And a lot of people, I think actually probably the public, seems like the UK public in general thinks this is a fine thing to do, and that as long as people are informed, consent, people are allowed to make their own choice in a wide variety of areas. But I think if you're the politician or you're the person who supports this, if it goes wrong, it's kind of squitty, it's a bit icky, is there going to be, are there going to be, 20-year-olds who die who wouldn't have done? And so maybe you delay, you say no to this, you delay the certification of your vaccine by 3 months, and X 10 or 100,000 people die. And it seems mad to imagine that's the way policy works. But I think when you think about the incentives on individuals, and there's like these big structures as well, I think it makes a lot of sense. And I think, and this isn't to say that it's okay. I just that's why, as going back to this previous question, my question is often like, how can you get people to have better incentives? And how can you reward people better for their successes and punish them less harshly for comparatively small failures? I think those are more interesting questions than like, how can you just get people to do the right thing? Because I think getting large organizations, in the private sector, you've got to remember that like large organizations can know that things are going wrong, but they can't fix anything. Then they go bankrupt, and then other organizations replace them. But in national policy, you can't afford for your army to go bankrupt. You can't afford for it just to stop functioning.
Right. No, I completely agree. I think those are all very compelling points about how the incentive structures are very different between policymakers and business owners, for example. And I could actually see that whole line of thinking being adduced in favor of two different diametrically opposed ideologies. And I wanted to get your response. I was just thinking about this as you were talking. On the one hand, you have this situation in which policymakers operate on a very short time frame, 2 to 4 years generally, maybe 5 or 6 years if they're repeatedly elected, but they're constantly forced to engineer consent, right? They have to go back and they have to speak to their record and they have to talk to the electorate, which is not necessarily problematic, but number one, it occupies a lot of their time. And number two, it means that if they're out of office in 4 years, they're not going to be on the hook for whatever bad decisions were made theoretically. And so I've seen people argue in favor of monarchy along those grounds and saying, well, what you really need is you need the state to be the property of a family, a group of people who think in intergenerational terms. On the other hand, as you're talking about the fact that a VC can make one big bet that becomes a unicorn and pays for all their losses, whereas a policymaker is much more likely to be hounded for one spectacular failure or many spectacular failures, even if they have one slam dunk that works really well, you could make the argument that that's a reason to privatize far more things, so that people's bottom line is tied more directly to things like the provisioning of public goods or handling things like pandemic response. So on the one hand, I could see all of your statements, which I believe to be true for the most part, supporting a monarchy, something long-term where the state is almost privately owned by a family or a dynasty, or on the other hand, being used in favor of far more radical capitalism than is prevalent in the West. So how do you respond to all of that?
I think Garrett Jones has a great book called 10% Less Democracy on this. 10%, not 100%, 10%.
Right.
Where he talks about how some systems, we're already very aware, central banks, for instance, it's very normal that a central bank should be politically independent. We have good papers which show that central bank independence is a good thing. It leads to, I believe, sort of more stability, less sort of ups and downs in the economy. I think the implication is maybe that the suggested theory is maybe that politicians, if they could control those levers, would be tempted to push us into a boom just before the election,
Right.
And there would be no option to them, so they wisely push that power out of their own hands, and then you have better results for everyone. And that's not a controversial thing. And so, his book, and I'd recommend people read it, 10% Less Democracy, argues maybe you could have slightly longer terms. And, there's been some stuff, I think it was in Mexico, they redistricted. And so they were really able to see, in the US, you have senators who are elected once every 2 years. Batches of senators, that is, every 6 years, but batches are elected every 2 years.
Right.
And so in this example, they had to sort of reallocate the batches. So some people suddenly were serving for 6 years, some for 4, some for 2. And so these people all got elected at the same time. And then you could sort of see, okay, how do these people behave differently as groups? And, in the last 2 years, people vote differently. They're voting for their base to get re-elected. Whereas in the first 4 years, they have a bit more freedom. I think they propose more bills, I think is that sort of stuff. So that's the first thing to say, is that, I think maybe not a monarchy, but maybe you could look at some stuff around longer terms to give people more long-term incentives. And I think, I'd say in the US, the Senate's terms are better than the House's terms. I'd like to see longer terms in the House, say. In the second case, again, Garrett Jones does a good job of talking about changes that you'd like to see in someone else's country.
Right.
And so maybe I'm going to defend myself by saying, wouldn't it be interesting if not in my country, not for any of the people that I love,
Right.
but some other country were to test, maybe a lot more privatization. I see South Korea has elected, I think, a president who is sort of quite libertarian, I think, who wants to remove the working hours directive, remove the minimum wage, remove food standards, and that's not a thing I would want, nor is it a thing I'd agree with. But we're going to get to find out if he implements those changes, what those things happen. I guess for what it's worth, I think probably, I think the minimum wage and the working hours are going to be okay, and I think the food standards might go badly. Is sort of my quick, sketchy suggestion. But yeah, I think the difficulty here is still that some of those factors we talked about. How do you privatize a coronavirus response? How do you privatize an army? Like, I think those are like, if your army loses, it's game up, it's game over. And so I still think there are some things even for other countries you say, well, that's just you. The question is how you incentivize people. And I think you've seen it again with Ukraine. You've seen that probably people weren't being honest with Putin, that maybe his lowers, they were scared of him.
Yeah.
And so they told him he had, 10 or 100 times more resources than they actually had. Perhaps, that's just one theory as to why things are going so badly. And, how would privatization have worked there? Maybe they would have just been like, no, we don't want to take this deal. And maybe that would have been good for the world conflict. Or maybe people would have been like, no, we need to actually control our army. So that's, I guess those are some thoughts.
It occurs to me that we can actually tie together the prediction markets thread of this conversation with the policy and the policy thread of this conversation. So I'm not super active in the space, but based on what I've read and based on what you've said so far, prediction markets seem to be primarily used to speculate about major current events and also to try to incentivize people to accurately aggregate information to arrive at good conclusions. But from what I've seen, it seems like the original progenitors of this idea, like Robin Hanson, had much grander visions for it. They imagined that prediction markets might be a way of running companies internally. And I'm sure you've heard the idea of futarchy, right? Yeah, futarchy, where you actually put certain kinds of policy decisions like this in the hands of a prediction market. And I mean, there's concerns around gamification or people buying shares and sort of running prices of an outcome up or whatever. You have all the standard concerns, but you must have given some thought as to whether or not this is a mechanism for arriving at better policy. And since we've been discussing incentives and we've been discussing the structuring of governance, how do you think a prediction market might fare in that? It's sort of a middle way between what we've been discussing, I think.
Yeah, I'd say I'm bullish. I should acknowledge some sort of conflict of interest. I've done some consultancy for a company that's trying to push some of this, trying to build some of these kinds of markets. But I mean, yeah, I think I find the arguments quite compelling that you want to encourage there to be markets that exist on questions you care about, and you want to reward the people who are getting it right in order to get clear signals. Again, had there been a market for how many people will die from a new disease this year in 2020, then that market would have skyrocketed in February and March, and the newspapers would have had to have reported on it, and then the government might have had to act sooner, because a lot of these organizations, news organizations don't want to print based on nothing. They want to be able to say, oh, this is the reason. And I think governments they don't want to be seen to overreact. They want to be moving some way in step with public opinion. And so it seems quite understandable to me that there's sometimes delays in both of those steps. Whereas if you have a prediction market which can front run, much in the same way that if you think a company's doing badly, a prediction market, the market is a kind of a prediction market in itself. The market can have the value fall ahead of time, and therefore suggest that people have a look at this company. Maybe there's fraud, maybe there's corruption. I think in the same way, policy markets can front run some of that information to allow decision makers to make better choices.
Why don't you sketch as futuristic a scenario as you want with respect to what a futarchy might look like, what it might look like to actually have major policy decisions being made by prediction markets?
Well, I guess there's as I understand it, and again, I think listeners should take this as a broad brush overview rather than things which are definitely exactly right. But as I understand it, there's sort of two steps to it. Initially, you could just have an advisory market. So these markets would be on big, important events. Maybe you'd ask people. You get people to sort of vote on some kind of welfare metric. So something that they think is important. It combines, inflation and house prices and the number of people who survive and age and longevity. You combine all these things together, and then every time that you've got something going up for a vote, you ask people to predict the welfare metric sometime after the vote has gone through. And so, maybe the welfare metric includes a time span even within it. So, you're going to pass a bill about house building, and people think it's going to work. But you look at the two numbers that come back if the bill passes and if it doesn't, and they're identical. And house building is some component of your welfare metric. So you should imagine that this house building bill is going to push up the one where, it's going to leave a dent between these two markets. And so, people look at it and they go, well, it doesn't seem to be making much of a difference, but let's try it anyway. So they pass the bill, and then one of those markets returns all of its money. So it kind of fizzles into existence as if it had never happened. And then in the other market, people will get paid based on how close their estimates were. And, we get into the mathematical structure of that. It's not that complicated. But, if they, the people who are close get the money and the people who are far don't.
Right.
And so that's the sort of simple advisory one. And then the sort of full futurarchy is that if the market is higher for pass the bill gets passed. And if it's lower, it doesn't get passed. Then there's no voting going on.
Right.
It's just literally the markets decide the outcome. And anytime you want to do something, you ask the markets, they return a yes or a no. And there's sort of two steps always. There's the passing of the bill where one market kind of happens and the other doesn't, and then you've got to wait for a little bit of time afterwards to actually resolve the market and pay people out, because they can be wrong, right? But if they're wrong, then they're going to lose a lot of money.
So So that brings up the natural question about a human-based prediction market versus an AI-based prediction market, and I'm assuming that sometime in the not too distant future that the AI prediction market will be much more accurate. Have you given much thought to that?
I guess I think AI is underrated, so I think it's good that we talk about it. I guess I think that if you have AI that can predict sort of short and long-term future events better than people, then you might have some different concerns on your hands, i.e., are they better at science than people?
Mm-hmm.
Are they? Because if so, then there's just going to be a real broad range of changes, which mean it's it's harder to say. I think if we're talking about the kind of the sort of softer, like automating market makers within current markets, I think some of that already probably happens. I think some people are building little bots. I think that's much less interesting. So I guess I would agree with you that there's like something interesting going on, but I think it's going to be far too interesting to say, because as soon as you can accurately predict whether a policy will improve or make things worse, and as soon as an AI can do that, then you've got an AI which is capable of making like very high level important decisions well, and at that point you have a general intelligence. And so I think sort of all bets are off as to what everything else looks like.
Just put that in charge. Just make it like a monarchy. I don't know how you pronounce it, but like a monarchy, but the A is an AI. Yeah,
yeah. I mean, I don't know how concerned your listeners are about AI safety. I'm pretty concerned. I hope if we can get to the sort of the AI rules and is a benevolent ruler, then the beers are on me. I will let out a big sigh of relief, because I think there's some pretty concerning scenarios pretty close to that one if it turns out that something could eventually end up in charge or affecting all of our lives. And maybe, I think that's, again, an underrated problem. I think there's some underrated problems. I think we've talked a bit about nuclear war over the last few weeks. I think nuclear war is a little bit underrated. I think AI is a little bit underrated. I think pandemics and biorisk are a little bit underrated. There's some things which are underrated by people. And I hope that sort of that nice future comes. And as I say, the beers can be on me.
Yeah. What are your thoughts around AI safety? It's something that I used to spend a lot of time on, and I haven't visited the debate in probably 10 years. But once upon a time, I read a lot of the papers that were coming out of the Machine Intelligence Research Institute and thought a lot about it. So I don't know if you're sort of up on where things stand now, but if you have any comments on that, I'd be interested in hearing them.
I'm not up on the papers, but I find the sort of general thrust of the argument compelling, that much in the same way you might be able to build a sort of chess computer which understands that when you move the rook over there, then maybe in 3 turns time it can take some pieces that you care about and you want to stop it, so you preemptively put some kind of defense in there. An AI system might be able to learn about that on a much larger scale and be able to preemptively realize that humans might want to turn it off or do something bad to it or stop its goals to turn everything into paper clips.
Right.
And so it might take some preventative action against humans. And I understand if people don't find that compelling. All I can say is that I've thought about it a bit and I'd like to think about it some more. And I do find it relatively compelling. And so, I think it's an underrated problem. And, I think if people want to read more, I guess, they can search AI safety. They can look at things like Less Wrong or the AI Alignment Forum. And I think there's like a lot of wiser people than me who've got stuff to say on that. But I think it's a really, I think we live in a critical time for the human race. I find that quite compelling. And I think, the growth of AI is one reason why. And, I want the best people and the most sort of kind and gracious people working on this to try and fix that problem.
So when you're looking at something like the Ukraine war, there's a lot of moving parts. Well, when you look at the burned out hulks of equipment along the road, there's a lot of non-moving parts there too.
Right.
But in a predictions market, do you predict the survival of Putin? Do you predict the survival of Zelensky? Do how do you pull apart all of the moving pieces to analyze? Because any one component can torpedo the whole thing.
Yeah, I kind of think that this sort of stuff really is a thing I really like about prediction markets, because you can ask the question, oh, does it affect the prediction markets I care about? So you're seeing all these like burnout hulks, and you're hearing these heroic stories, and you're like, well, is it affecting the market for the fall of Kiev? And if it's not, then why should I care? And I'm not saying about the human tragedy. I can understand why I care about that, but maybe is this just sort of like news porn? You're just filling me full of stories that don't actually affect things. So yeah, I think, the markets that I would care about in relation to this are things like, will Putin still be in power? Will Zelensky still be in power? Will there be an agreed ceasefire? Will Kyiv fall? Will a nuclear weapon be launched? No-fly zone seems very unlikely now, but there was a time when the question was, will there be a no-fly zone? Will NATO troops, will there be some sort of attack against NATO troops? And I think those questions are the questions I'm interested in. And, to sort of reverse your question, if something doesn't affect those markets, I don't need to hear about it. I think it's very easy to be oversaturated with news.
Do you have any idea whether or not there are officials making major decisions like this today that are consulting prediction markets? I mean, it seems like as a mechanism for arriving at true conclusions, they are becoming more and more popular, and more and more people are aware of them. It seems kind of unlikely to me that Joe Biden is checking Metaculus every day, but isn't it at least possible that there are decisions being made after consulting with prediction markets?
So, I mean, some governments have them. So the Economist reported that the UK government has it's not a prediction market, but a prediction polling platform run by a group called Cultivate Labs, who run prediction markets. I think they've done maybe some Eastern European governments or such. There was, and I think according to, I think it's the forecasting newsletter, again, there's a forecast newsletter written by Nuno Sempere, and I would recommend anyone follow that. That's something like forecasting.substack or something similar. Just search forecasting newsletter Nuno, Nuno, and you'll get it. And he talks about there was a program around forecasting in the US, and then there's and that's moving, and I think there's some sort of government listening in there. I think the question is to what extent key decision makers are following those, and I guess I all I can say is that I would like to see more key decision makers looking at those. So, Philip Tetlock in his book talks about how in the research he did in the original the ARPA tournaments, his super forecasters were able to outperform government super forecasters, so not government analysts, that is, who had secret information. They had the top secret government information, or maybe not top secret, but they had information that these forecasters didn't, and the forecasters were able to predict events more accurately. And so, I want governments I care about to have more accurate information, be able to make better decisions. And to some extent, this is a more controversial thing, but I probably even want the Russian, I don't want the Russian government, I'm not on the side of the Russian government, but I think if the Russian government had known how this was going to end, they might not have done it. And that would have been better for anyone. So I think, if you can surface this information ahead of time, if Putin could go back in time and whisper in his own ear, would he say, actually, maybe just stop at the Donbass region, just call it a day?
Well, fantastic. You've given us a lot to chew on, and I really appreciate that. Are there any thoughts you'd like to leave us with?
I guess two things. One, thanks to you both. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah.
It's been fun, and I hope your audience enjoyed it. At Nathan PM Young, that's where I tweet my various interesting and uninteresting thoughts. And I guess also just a plug. There's a really good blog that I think covers some of the things that we've talked about here, some of the sort of AI important, and I think it's called Cold Takes. I think it's a really good blog, and I would recommend anyone who's been interested in it, cold-takes.com. I'd recommend that they read that.
Well, we will point our listeners in that direction. So 3 cheers for Futarchy, and if the AIs take over, then we'll call you about those beers. How about that?
Thanks both.
Yeah. Thank you, Nathan.
Thank you.